There is nothing else besides Hashem. That is a fundamental principle of our faith, which actually manifests in 3 different levels and 3 different ways that we translate that faith into our behavior. So we're going to start in our parasha. The parasha says, "There's 2 psukim in our parasha that both express the same principle, that the Eibishter is our God. One is the pasuk that you have been shown in order that you should know that Hashem is our God, or is the God. There's none other beside Him. And the second pasuk is you should know today, and you should place it in your heart that the Eibishter is the God in the heavens above and on the earth below. Ein oid, there's nothing else. Now the difference between the two is that the pasuk the first pasuk said you should know that Hashem is God. The pasuk whereas the second pasuk got into detail. That the Eibishter is God in the heavens and the earth. What's the difference? What would seem to be the simplest difference between the 2 psukim is context. The pasuk that says you were shown to know that Hashem is God, that's talking about, as the context implies, that is the awareness that and the consciousness that was given to the Jewish people at Matan Torah, when the Eibishter revealed Himself to them, so that they could see that the Eibishter is one. Because at the Maimed Har Sinai, we got to perceive the reality of Hashem's oneness from Hashem's perspective. And from Hashem's perspective, there's no difference between heaven and earth. Therefore, in this definition of this level of awareness of Hashem, there's no space for that detail about the heavens above and the earth below. Whereas the second pasuk that says you should know and you should place it in your heart, that's an instruction to people how we should behave. That we have to invest time and effort and energy in order for us to understand and to know, not just to know in theory, but to translate it into something we feel in our hearts, that the Eibishter is God. Because this is an awareness of Hashem's oneness, which is the product of human investment and endeavor. From a human's perspective, there is a big distinction between heaven and earth. To the extent that understanding the Eibishter's oneness in context of heaven and understanding it in context of earth are 2 different concepts that we have to understand, appreciate, and meditate on. And you can see this reflected in the Medrash on that pasuk where it says Yisro, although he acknowledged Hashem, put it in context of the fact that there are other deities, and the Eibishter is the greatest of those deities. As the Matnas Kahuna points out, Yisro's impression was that there are other deities, and out of all of them, the Eibishter is the greatest. Naaman acknowledged partially the fact that the Eibishter is one. Because his statement after he was cured by Elisha, he says, now I recognize that there is no other God except by the Jews. In other words, as the Matnas Kuna points out, he acknowledged that there is a single Eibishter over the physical, didn't speak about the heavens. Rachav acknowledged that the Eibishter is God in heaven and earth. As the pasuk says, she said, your God is the God in the heavens above and earth below. And therefore, not only did she acknowledge that the Eibishter is in control of earth, but in the heavens as well, He is the only deity. Even in Shamayim, which you don't see, the Eibishter is in control over there. But she left the concept of the Eibishter being, so to speak, within God, within the earth itself. She didn't discuss that. Whereas Moshe Samei Af B'Chalol Shel Olam, says the Medrash, but Moshe Rabbeinu made clarity, or made clear to us, that the Eibishter is God even in the depths of the earth. That he said that the Eibishter is God in the heavens above and in the earth below, meaning even within the so to speak, bowels of the earth. Einoid. And he said, Einoid. What does Einoid mean? Even within the inner, so to speak, depths of the earth, the Eibush is there as well. Keloimar, in other words, what we could extract from these psukim is when humans are processing the concept of the Eibush's oneness, there are 3 degrees of that process. A perspective of how the Eibush is in the heavenly realms. Beis valoris mitochas, how the Eibush is on earth. And then and then there's like a deeper perspective of the physicality that the Eibush, there's nothing else besides the Eibush, even, so to speak, in the bowels of the earth. So we have to understand. The fact that Torah, which is absolute truth, identifies these 3 perspectives, muvan, that we can understand from that. The Torah is not only looking to address the fact that humans might be misguided and misinterpret how the Eibush is, and so we've got to clarify for them. The fact that Torah addresses these 3 perspectives means that there is truth to the sense that there's a distinction between how you see the Eibush's oneness in the spiritual realms, in the physical realms, and so to speak, in the bowels of the earth. In other words, when a human achieves the state of knowing Hashem's oneness, and how do you get there? That means that a person contemplates with genuine, authentic seichel. Each of these 3 angles will give us a whole new perspective on the idea of the Eibush being one. So we need to understand. What's the premise that a person would have intellectually to assume that the Eibush is only the Eibush in heaven, God forbid? That we then have to address it and say, it's not only in heaven that the Eibush is Eibush, it's even on earth. And then we have to take it even further, not only on earth, but even in the parts of the earth that are, so to speak, hidden from us. So why does the Torah have to address this? Why is it even a question? Who in their right mind would think the Eibush is only an Eibush in heaven? Well, the truth is, many people do think that way and certainly have thought that way through history. Perhaps the answer lies in something we know, that the Eibush is exalted over and above all the nations, which means the perception and philosophy of the nations. The argument that the Goyim have and why they serve idols is because they said the Eibush left the world. And why is that? The reason they believe that the Eibush left the world is because they believe that expresses Hashem's greatness. He doesn't get his hands dirty with the day-to-day running of the universe. As far as they're concerned, it would be a terrible degradation for Hashem to have to get involved in human issues or physical issues or universal issues. Therefore, the Eibush left the running of this physical universe in the hands of angels and the various astrological energies, etc. So perhaps that's the reason why the Torah has to instruct us not to think like that. To recognize that the Eibush is God not only in the spiritual realms but on earth as well. So we'd be clear that the Eibush is in absolute control of what happens on the earthly plane as well, in the physical universe as well. And that might be a good explanation. So that's why the Torah had to use this pasuk, to ensure that we don't think like pagans think. But when you understand and remember what the Alter Rebbe says in Shar Yichud V'Emunah, it's not so simple. The Alter Rebbe in Shar Yichud tells us that pasuk, that you have to know that it's an Eibush in the heavens above and the earth below. There the Alter Rebbe says that's not that the pasuk wants to clarify we shouldn't think that the Eibush is too great to be involved in our world. But rather it's to address the possibility that people might believe there's another subterranean God, who's somewhere in the subterranean waters controlling the world. So you have to know there isn't such a thing. The Eibush is everywhere, from top to bottom. And the reason why you would take this approach is because of the context. This pasuk is shortly after the pasuk that tells us about the revelation and awareness of Hashem that happened in Matan Torah. Because of And what is the pasuk addressing when it brings that pasuk Atorei Seladas? It's to clarify that we shouldn't have misguided perspectives. In case you're going to get distracted and start to make various kinds of idolatrous forms to represent the deities that people imagine, or pen goymer, and perhaps you're going to look up at the heavens, etc. Which makes it only logical that the next pasuk, which follows with an instruction to know that Hashem is Hashem in the heavens, earth, etc., including the earth below, is clearly addressing the fact that you shouldn't believe there's some kind of a deity that's living somewhere under the ocean or under the subterranean waters or whatever it is. So if that's the case, then we're back to our question, why do we have to address something like that? Why would you imagine that there's some God lurking where we can't see him inside the world, and you have to be then told, so the Alter Rebbe asks that question, does anybody in their wildest imagination imagine that there was a deity inside the earth or under the sea, that the Torah has to give us such a stern warning, set it clearly in your heart that and there's nothing else? To which the Alter Rebbe explains, the instruction to know that Eibush is God is it's not to debunk the theory that there's another God. God forbid, that's not even on the agenda. Rather, what the Torah wants us to know is there's nothing else, no other entity besides the Eibush. Because the truth is that every single thing that we take as real and that we take so seriously, in truth, is completely bottled to Hashem. Completely. Bim metzias. It's as if they don't exist. Kloimer, in other words. Seeing as the creative process used to make everything that exists is not taking existing material and then forming it as items, but rather it's creating me'ayin from absolute nothingness. Something that comes from nothing needs consistent, uninterrupted input of life, otherwise it doesn't exist. If the Eibishter's power of infusing life into existence would pause for even a nanosecond, the item, the creation, would automatically, naturally, instantaneously revert to what it was before there was creation. What was it before creation? Nothing. So the Alter Rebbe is explaining, this pasuk is not telling us don't believe there are other gods. This pasuk is telling us don't believe there's anything in the world besides the Eibishter, because every single thing has to be pumped full of energy by Hashem at every single moment. Which would explain why in that pasuk it has to single out specifically on earth below. To teach us that even our physical materialistic world, which to all of our perspectives looks real and looks as if it exists independently, even that, even the Oretz Mitochas, is absolutely neutralized, absolutely bottled to the Eibishter. So that's a powerful concept, we just have to understand it a little better. It's true that this concept, that the Eibishter is one on the earth and below, which illustrates that even the physical world that appears to be so independent is actually completely bottled to Hashem. That's something which is counterintuitive. And therefore we get it why the Torah is to give a clear instruction. Set this in your heart, because it's not natural to be in your heart. You have to learn how to get your head around this. But let's not forget that the beginning of the pasuk is you need to know this information. Which means not only do we have to be given a specific instruction and warning, make sure you feel this, because it's not natural to feel that everything is bottled to Hashem, but you have to know this. Why do I need such a strong push to know that everything is bottled, or that there's nothing else besides Hashem? And that doesn't seem to make sense. The minute the brain processes the idea that there's nothing besides Hashem, there's nothing outside of Hashem, because everything is completely submissive and neutralized before Him. If my brain processes the principle of Einoid, that there's nothing besides Hashem, because everything was created from naught, and therefore, if it's not being kept alive right now by the Eibusha, it goes back to zero. Therefore, its truest life, and therefore its truest being is God. So if I understand that principle, surely I understand that it applies to everything that exists, regardless of whether it be spiritual or physical. Because anything that is created from nothing needs a constant flow of existence flowing into it from a source. So how come it is, or why is it even possible that in the intellectual process I would make a distinction between the fact that the Eibishter is one and therefore everything is bottled to Him in the spiritual, and how that is in the physical? Surely, logically, it's all the same. Melee, in terms of feelings, yes, I feel that the spiritual are dedicated to Hashem, and I don't feel that the physical is dedicated to Hashem. So I've got to get that into my sensation, into my appreciation of the world. But for Yodaita, as an intellectual concept, surely it's automatic. If everything is created by the Eibishter, everything doesn't exist without the Eibishter. So, let's just deepen this point, that the Torah telling us that there's there's only the Eibishter in the heavens and in the earth, is not only to tackle the human misunderstanding, because the human perception is this table is real, this world is real, but the fact that this is also an issue that has to be dealt with in the objective intellectual space. So the Alter Rebbe, when discussing this principle, that in order for things to exist, there has to be an uninterrupted flow of divine enlivening energy at all times. Maybe Rabbi Nazak Nes Pirush Baal Shem Tov Pasuk. So to illustrate that point, the Alter Rebbe quotes how the Baal Shem Tov interprets a pasuk which says, that your words, Hashem, constantly stand within the heavens. And the Baal Shem Tov explains that means the words that you, the Eibishter, said in the Asar Mamoris, for example, let there be a firmament, meaning some kind of a heaven. Teves ve'osios elu, the words and letters, Yehi Rokia b'seich hamayim, Eloheinu nitzav v'svayim d'sleinu b'teich Rokia shamayim lach yosam. Those words live within the Rokia, within the heaven, to keep it in existence. It is the code running the program called Rokia. And therefore, if the code is corrupted, the program won't run. And if the code is deleted, the program will disappear. Mamshich. And there the Alter Rebbe explains, that's not only something that applies to the heavens, that they're running on divine code. That applies to all creations in all the worlds, the high and lower, even in our physical world and within our world itself, in the inanimate world within our world. Every single one of them, their existence is completely contingent on the words and letters that emerge from the 10 utterances of creation. And that's what brings everything, including the inanimate, into existence instead of being absolute non-existence. Now you'll say, but there are not enough mamoros, there are not enough words to go around. So the Alter Rebbe continues and adds to the picture, even those beings that are not listed in any way, not referenced in any way in the 10 utterances of creation, they also receive their vitality through these Asar Maimoris. And how does that happen? Because there are various evolutionary processes that the Eibishter uses in order to translate the original language into the code for these specific things that are too minor to be included in the original code language. Maybe Sham Oifanim, and he gives various examples, whether it's Sirufim and Oisia and Gematrias, various ways that the letters get rearranged or that there are codes within the codes, and that's what creates every single thing that exists. And that relevance plays out in the Torah language name for every single thing that exists. Each name contains within it the particular calibrated energy that belongs to that particular item. And that energy evolved out of the Asar Mamoris that the Torah uses. So now, the fact that the pasuk specifies that Hashem, your words always stand in the heavens, and just to note that nitzav means to stand with strength and firmness. That means that Shamayim is in some way unique, different to all other creations. And here, the Torah is not even talking about us and our perceptions and our awareness or misawareness. It's just talking objectively. And yet it's saying Shamayim. That where are Hashem's words? In Shamayim. More than that implies that the distinction between the reality of the spiritual and the physical and how they are bonded to the Eibishter's oneness is actually different. The spiritual and physical are different. Not only from our perspective, that the way in which the Eibishter's words manifest in and give life to existence is fundamentally different if it's in the spiritual realms of existence or everything else. Which is why the pasuk said, where are your words? Bashamayim. And once we understand that there is that distinction between the spiritual and the physical realms, there clearly is a distinction and an insight into what it means that the Eibishter is one on the physical plane over the fact that we say that the Eibishter is one in the spiritual plane. So Shlomo Rabbi said, what is this distinction and what is the message of the Torah here? So the Baal Shem Tov's great innovation here is not just that there's this generic concept that the existence of creations is completely contingent on the infusing of energy from the Creator who brings them into life at every moment. It's not just a generic principle, it's a very specific principle where each detail is relevant. It's really important for us to know that these original words from the Asar Ma'amores are manifested into the heavens, into the spiritual realms. All the various strata of the spiritual realms. And likewise in all of creation. That every single created item has some kind of code or manifestation or combination of those divine letters and words that give this particular thing its life. In other words, our focus over here is not just simply saying, you as a created being, you need divine energy, otherwise you can't exist. That's true. But it's not true to say that if you've been infused with this divine energy, you're good to go. You could operate remotely. You got kind of a battery pack, and now you could live. That would be kind of, if it worked that way, it'd be similar to sun rays coming from the sun. Obviously, every sun ray comes from the sun. And how do you know that it's completely sourced in the sun? The proof is to take of the minute there's any kind of blockage between the source of the light and the light, it disappears immediately. It doesn't linger for a few seconds afterwards. That tells you that it's completely reliant on the source. And the fact still remains that even though the sun ray is completely dependent on the sun ray is not the sun. It's actually independent from the sun. It's far smaller, less powerful than the sun. So we need to know that's not how it works with Eibishter, but rather that the divine creative power is manifest within the creation constantly. Which explains how you could say Ein Oid, there's nothing besides Hashem in the clearest, most complete way. Because we're saying Ein Shum Etzias Melvad Elikus. There is no other entity, no other existence besides the Eibishter. That's it. Why is that? Because the Eibishter's words are completely invested inside the creation, where the creation lives in its so-called reality. Then that tells me that the creation is in no way separate or distinct from the word of Hashem. And so therefore the vitality and the soul of every living thing is the divine word in it. Which helps me understand why every single thing is absolutely nothing. Meaning, if, for example, you have a program that's running off code, if the code gets deleted, there is nothing left to the program. The program is the code. So that tells you that even though outwardly I see the code, I see the program. So let's say, for example, I pull out my phone, and there's an app on my phone, and I'm using that app. That's the Project Likutei Sichos app. I'm using the app. If the code running that app somehow got deleted, everything's going to disappear. You can't say the app exists independently of the code. No. So it's the same thing with creation. If the chayas of the creation has to be the divine words in all of their manifestations and permutations that are inside those things constantly, that implies those things don't really exist other than when the code runs, which means they don't have an identity of their own. And that explains why each entity needs its own divine code. As the Alter Rebbe goes into detail in Shar Yichud and says, even the most inanimate object has to have its own divine code, its own so-called soul. Because in order to invest the divine energy into each individual being, the divine energy has to step down from its reality, which is not a bespoke reality. It doesn't take into consideration the nuances of creation. And instead now it has to calibrate itself to suit the particular needs of a particular creation. Each individual creation uniquely. If that didn't happen, and the divine energy remained divine energy, which is infinite energy, it would be too advanced and too intense to be able to engage with and infuse into a creation. You're going to say, but the Eibishter is all capable. The Eibishter could have invested his infinite power into a finite being. He could do it. But he didn't do it because he wants us to have awareness, and he wants us to be able to recognize and process and compute godliness. Of course, relative to whichever limitations he built into us. That's how he wants the nature of creation to be. Therefore, how did the Eibishter create creations? In a way that it shouldn't be, that the koyach ha-boire, that the Eibishter's creation is so fundamentally beyond us. But he wanted to create a systematic, trickle-down system, which we call in the language of Kabbalah and Chassidus the hierarchy of spiritual existence. To the extent that the Eibishter is able to tailor-make any bit of energy to suit the particular destination, which could be us, or could be a stone, or whatever it is. Now we can appreciate why the Torah wants to present the concept that the Eibishter is God from three different perspectives, as we've already discussed. Seeing as the whole concept of Ein Oid is completely based on the idea that the Eibishter's koyach gets into and gives life to every single individual without exception, you might have said, okay, there are different ways that this happens. When can I argue that the Eibishter's koyach is completely invested and infused into beings? If those beings are spiritual, because they're very elevated creatures or creations, and therefore they are suited to receive divine power. Whereas if I'm talking about the physical reality, where the creations are both physical and material, they are not designed to absorb divine energy. I'd say, well, because you're not suited to absorb divine energy, the kind of divine energy that you get doesn't actually infuse, doesn't actually enter the space. Which means that these entities, of course, they constantly need the lifeline of divine energy to exist, but not in a way that divine energy becomes invested within them. It's a standalone, remote power. And then we get an even bigger surprise. Even those creations that are not listed in the 10 utterances of creation, which implies that they are such simplistic or lowly creatures, that they are obviously so lowly they don't get that direct infusion from those statements that Eibishter made to create the world. But their chayus has to first be evolved and repackaged until eventually it could evolve to the point that it could give rise to this particular creation. There's the big surprise. Even there, the Eibishter is as much Eibishter, as much invested, as much part and parcel, and they are as much contingent on and surrendered to, submissive to the Eibishter's chayus, as if it was the highest spiritual realms. So every abstract spiritual philosophical concept in Judaism has an application in spiritual service. Because we are a microcosm, and we are a reflection of how things are in the macrocosm. The ultimate purpose of Avodas Hashem is that whatever we're meditating on, learning about, davening over, has to translate into action, and those actions are actually the most important principle. So if you want to get to that point, you want to get to the earth, tachlis, translation, which means to infuse the holiness that we learn about and that we contemplate on into the physical world, that goes through an evolutionary process, which has 3 parts. There are 3 stages. The 3 stages we've identified in the pasuk about awareness of Hashem's unity. First, there's a heaven state. Then, there's a physical state. And then there's this absolute recognition that Eibishter is everywhere, down to the smallest microbe. And they also link up to the language that the Alter Rebbe uses in Shar HaYuchad Vayimonu, which also expresses these 3 levels. That the Eibishter's words are in the heavenly realms. That he says not only in the heavenly realms, but in everything that is created, including our physical world. That's the next phase. And then Gimel, he says, even the lowest of the low, the things meaning things that are so rudimentary, they're not even mentioned in the Asar Mamoris. So in order for our service of the Eibishter to be appropriate on a daily basis, you have to prepare. It doesn't just happen in a vacuum. You start by sleeping at night, which is part of how to serve the Eibishter, because it releases the neshama on high and rejuvenates a person so that you can serve the Eibishter properly the next day. And that is the reason why as soon as a person wakes up, the very first thing we do is make that statement. We acknowledge and thank the Eibishter for returning our neshama. We acknowledge that who are we when we wake up in the morning? We have a neshama that came from Shomayim that has resources that rejuvenate us and refresh us to go take on the day. After you've made that positioning statement, you start serving the Eibishter. And serving the Eibishter, a big chunk of that is getting the neshama to be able to infuse its way right through the entire body, the consciousness of the person, the character of the person, the behavior of the person, which is primarily achieved by focused contemplative davening. Because if we do that right, then the body, the physical, including the physical mind, is able to accept and process and appreciate the Eibishter and feel the Eibishter, even in the physical. So you have the neshama which starts up Bashamai Mimal Moidani. Then how do I get this through to my body? 2 steps. I have to be in the community at shul, davening with a minyan. And straight after that I have to sit down and learn a shir Torah. If that allows the neshama to seep into all the various components of my body, so I become a neshama-oriented person. But that's still in a protected environment, in a holy environment. That's like being one of these more advanced creations that get a direct spiritual plug-in to the 10 utterances. I'm getting a direct spiritual plug-in to my davening and my learning. So then the next phase is to go from there. I've got to step out into the space of the world. I have to behave in a way that conforms to societal norms. Which pretty much describes the Jewish interaction with things that the Torah permits me to interact with, but they're not yet mitzvahs. That's like those creations that are not actually mentioned in the Torah by name. So these are the parts of the world that are not mentioned by the Torah as mitzvahs. If I prepare it properly by accessing Bashamai Mimal with the consciousness of Moidani, and then infusing that baris mitochas through a focused contemplative davening, then that will empower me to be able to bring godliness into the ordinary things that I do. And even to the point that it's so effective that the physicality of this world is a non-entity for me. It's not attractive to me. It doesn't mean anything to me. And completely loses its independent identity. And that way I could reveal, even in the space of the world, I could reveal that there is absolutely nothing else besides Hashem. Even in the so-called parav things of this world, there's nothing else besides Hashem. And surely enough, that is the concept of Dira B'Tachtonim, which in turn brings Mashiach, which we should see immediately.